Welcome to Psych Soc O'Clock. Today we're doing the January interview and I'm here with Professor Lawrence Barsalou and we're going to talk about habits. Thank you very much for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
No, we're in the new studio Speech Lab today and we're amazed at how quiet it is in here because it's completely soundproof.
It's refreshing.
So why don't we start with talking about our own habits? Do you have any annoying habits that you're trying to break?
Well, the last time I did an interview like this, when I listened to it, I was struck by something I had no idea. It was a 1-hour interview, and I should go back and count, but I can't believe how many times I said "kind of," and so that would certainly be some kind of habit.
Yeah.
I think I just said it again, and. It's another one you just pointed out was
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting how those conversational habits get acquired and strengthened, and so that would perhaps be the most annoying habit of mine I've encountered in some time. I would say a curious habit. That I've developed is becoming increasingly interested in habits scientifically and studying habits and reading articles about habits. And so this might be sort of a new professional habit that I have, kind of a meta habit. It's an amazing topic and really important. And so I'm glad I have this new habit.
Yeah, well, it's very useful for us. I've noticed I sometimes try to start saying phrases sarcastically or as a joke, but then they make their way into my everyday speech. So I started saying indeed, like I'm some kind of Shakespearean.
Yeah.
So my friends they like to make fun of me for that one.
Mm-hmm.
But,
indeed.
Yeah, indeed. So why do you think you've more recently got interested in habits? What do you like about the topic?
Well, I'm by training and for most of my career a cognitive scientist, cognitive neuroscientist, and the focus of my work has been on conceptual processing. It's often referred to as semantic memory incorrectly. But I'm increasingly interested in health behaviors and in understanding the cognition that underlies health behaviors, and in particular the conceptual processing.
Okay.
And one thing that really attracts me to health behaviors is I think a lot of cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience pulls out cognitive processes out of their everyday context and studies them in isolation in ways that causes them to become distorted, like just looking at the perceptual front end of a process or the memory component without looking at the entire activity in which it's embedded. And I think this can really distort our understanding of these processes because they typically operate in the context of what I like to refer to as the situated action cycle, which I think is at the heart of a habit. Mm-hmm. And it basically is the idea that something occurs in the environment, which operates as a cue in traditional learning theories. That cue then triggers various kinds of goals and various kinds of cognitive states that could range from goals to norms about what you should be doing, your identity and how you feel like you should express yourself, or whether your self-interests are threatened or not. But so you have a cue so the situated action cycle begins with a cue and then triggers these cognitive states that are typically oriented around self-relevance. They're cognitive states that are designed to look after your interests. And then once those states become active, the third thing in the situated action cycle is you generate an affective state, which can include emotion and motivation. And then in turn, those affective states trigger the fourth part of the situated action cycle, which are actions. Mm-hmm. And action in humans is incredibly sophisticated and varied, ranging from executive actions in the cognitive system out to eye movements and overt bodily movements. And then finally, those actions produce outcomes, which would be the fifth phase of the situated action cycle. And I think that's the normal cycle and context of human behavior. And that's what essentially underlies a habit. A habit is a highly conditioned form of the situated action cycle where something occurs in the environment And then because you've laid down memories and patterning, it starts activating relevant cognitive states, say goals, values, which in turn produce emotions and motivations, which in turn produce action, and then which lead to an outcome. And a habit tends to take that form. And we have probably tens of thousands of those burned into our brains. And as we wander around our daily environments, the situations we're in just trigger those, and the behavior we carry out is largely governed by those. It's certainly not the only thing that's happened, and we're not, unless we're a zombie, we have more control than simply reacting habitually to the environment. And this is actually a big theme of habit research, is how able are you to overcome your conditioning, and how much control do you have at a more conscious, deliberate level to do what you want, given all of this conditioning that we have. So this is a really big issue in the habit literature. But I think this is where psychology and cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience should start, is with these full sorts of patterns of behavior, rather than just sort of artificially cutting off a piece of it and studying it in isolation.
Yeah.
So this is why I've become increasingly interested in habits, because they are the dominant form of this kind of cognitive activity, and I'm interested in the role that conceptual processing plays in those, but I'm also becoming interested in all the other parts of them as well.
It kind of reminds me of the way you were talking about it just then, the biopsychosocial model, because in I did IB before I came to study at the University of Glasgow, and we looked at cognitive processing completely in isolation as its own topic, and they would split psychology into biological, cognitive, and social. But you're completely right, it's really important to think about the overall theme and everything that influences the cognitive processing that we go through. And I suppose as well, with habits rather than with compulsions, at one point you probably made a decision that was a behaviour you wanted to perform, and then you have automatically almost trained yourself using, well, maybe some semi-form of classical conditioning or something to make that a more automatic response. So it's a lot less passive than I think some people might think.
Yeah, this is a huge area of much current interest for the last 10 or 20 years, and still extremely unresolved in many ways. There's a real tension between, on the one hand, so if you take like a habitual behavior like eating, a lot of people have good intentions to eat healthily, but then they don't, or to maintain sort of a healthy body weight, and they don't. And so people have health intentions, but they don't seem to act on them. So the big question's has been for quite a while, why are people eating as much as they do, especially when they have intentions not to do that? And one of the sort of proposals about what's going on is that they have all this conditioning such that when they encounter attractive food or attractive food cues, it triggers cognitive processes where they imagine eating the food that becomes so powerful that they eat even though they don't really want to. And so one of the major themes of this perspective is that we are heavily controlled by our environments, and because there are so much attractive food in the environment and so many powerful food cues that the food industry puts out and that food sellers put out, that because of the nature of the food environment that we're in, it's really hard to resist temptation and regulate our eating. And so there's this, on the one side, there is this idea that it's really hard to control, to follow your goals when you have such a certain environmental properties that you're dealing with.
I think I watched in a movie once, one of the characters was trying to lose weight, and he started eating with a blindfold so that he didn't have the cue, because having an empty plate is quite a powerful cue that we use sort of as a visual sign of when we're full. But I think something about mindful eating is quite popular at the moment, where you try and slow yourself down and think about the tastes in your mouth and the experience you're having, so that you don't just sort of shovel it in and finish.
Indeed.
But I think that's a really good point, and it's interesting to see how, because I've noticed in like magazines and on the internet, rather than saying, obviously there's the things about keto diets, and especially around New Year, all the kind of diets which are meant to make people more likely to lose weight or eat healthier. People keep saying, well, I shouldn't say people, the things I've read, which I'll try and link, say that it's more of a lifestyle change about how you think about eating, which is effective, rather than just going on a diet.
Absolutely. I think that is, diets hardly ever work, and when they do, they only produce a small amount of weight loss. It's really much more about permanently changing your habits. And probably a whole array of habits, not just eating, so adding in exercise and dealing with emotional issues that might be causing you to eat too much. But in terms of actually how we change those habits, that is a major question that is probably the area of psychology that in related sciences that deals with this is an area known as behavior change. It's there's a lot going on in this area at the moment. There's a lot of great work going on here in the UK. What's of interest is, how do you change someone's behavior permanently? How would you change someone's eating behavior? And what seems to be the case is that you have to attack it on many fronts. You have to make changes at many levels and deal with many factors. So you can't just have someone decide they want to change their habits. You're going to have to do a lot more than that. You're probably going to have to change their environment, their food environment, either how they shop, what's in their cupboards, when they go out to eat, where they go out to eat, things like that. You do have to work on the goals that you have, whether you're trying to eat for pleasure, whether you're trying to eat for health, and you have to be really careful with that, because if you get what a lot of work suggests is that you want to have a balance between eating for health and pleasure. That if you go completely on the health side, you'll do okay for a while, and then you'll just lose it because you have such a strong desire and need to do something enjoyable, and then you go on a binge. So it seems that people who are good at changing their eating habits allow themselves a certain amount of hedonic pleasure mixed in with their healthy eating, but it's well regulated and controlled so that it doesn't get out of hand and disrupt the changes you're trying to make. So it's sort of like you make eating for pleasure habitual, but in a much different way than it used to be, probably smaller amounts, less often, more aware of what you're doing. And then you've got to deal with affective factors. One of the, I just read a great review of all the factors that help people change their eating habits. And people will get stressed out and run into emotional challenges, and then you have to find good ways of dealing with those, because they can throw off your habits. You can revert back to your old habits. So you need to develop new skills for dealing with those and be prepared for when those kinds of things happen, to sort of have a way of trying to stay in your new habit regime.
Were there any tips in particular that they gave in the paper that you read?
Well, that's another area I'm really interested in, is stress. And there's actually a lot to be said about how you deal with stress. I think the main thing, just to go back to eating, I don't know how much you wanted to talk about stress, but just with eating is just to be aware that when you get stressed out, it can throw you off. And so if you're just prepared for the fact that when you get stressed, to maybe make a note of trying to stay on your new habits, that's the beginning. You haven't even dealt with what's happening emotionally yet, but just having the realization that you can get thrown off by this, and that you may want to really do something, maybe have a plan set up for what you're going to do to make sure that you don't consume way more calories for a period of time that you'll regret later.
Yeah, that's a very realistic approach, because I think sometimes when people have these habits, or especially with eating behaviours that they want to maintain over a long time, it's easy to see one setback as having ruined all of the work that you've done so far. But Rhoda from the Psychology Society, she said sometimes when she, for example, is trying to study and goes on Facebook for a bit too long or gets distracted, she used to sort of go, oh, okay, well, that's it then, I guess I've got to stop. All of that was for nothing. But she now tries to tell herself you can reset your day at any point and start again and just try and work to doing what you were hoping to again, despite the fact you may have had a setback.
Yeah, this seems to be a sign of people who are successful at changing their habits, is that when they do have a setback, they don't start catastrophizing about it and say, oh, I can't do this, I give up. They say, okay, well, yeah, I blew it, so what, that's cool, I can live with that. And then they get, back on board with the changes in their life. And that seems to be a really kind of a resilient quality of people who succeed at changing their habits. Another one that sort of goes with it, what we were just talking about, is kind of a flexibility, not being too rigid, and allowing yourself some hedonic pleasure, for example, not rigidly trying to only be healthy, because that's just going to fail. You need to have some flexibility and balance. And then resilience and forgiveness about when you do blow it.
Yeah. The action plan sounds like a really great strategy, I think.
Yeah, so in terms of like the situated action cycle, I think when you change your habits, you have to deal with every phase of it. You have to deal with what's in your environment, what you're doing cognitively, what's happening affectively, what you actually do with actions. And for actions, another really big one is portion size and eating frequency. So a lot of people, I've just read an article in the New York Times recently about how younger generations don't even eat meals anymore. They're just eating all the time whenever it's opportunistically available. And, this is incredibly unhealthy, and because you have no way of really gauging how much you're eating and keeping track of it. Whereas if you have set meals and snacks and you have some idea what the boundaries are, then it's easier, I think, to be aware of what you're eating and how many calories you're consuming. And so the frequency of when you eat and then how much you eat, the portion size, is really a key thing. And to be aware that there are all sorts of things that can cause you to eat more than you want. If you get a bigger plate, for example, or a bigger portion, you'll eat more than if you have a smaller plate or a smaller portion. And they're all, if you're eating crisps from a big bag as opposed to a little bag, you'll eat more from the big bag than from the little bag. There are all these kinds of things, that one can learn about as part of changing the habits, which you would then implement in the action phase. And then in the outcome phase, just being aware of sort of all the reasons people eat and what you're trying to achieve with your eating, besides just pleasure or emotional satisfaction, but also health. Another really important set of factors that recent reviews are identifying are social factors and identity factors. So, everybody's a part of a social network, and there's work going back for decades showing that you tend to reflect the weight in your social network and weight change in your. Yeah, so if you're in a social network of people who are overweight and are going to have trouble supporting you changing your habits to lose weight, that can be a real challenge, and that's something you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah.
Because social pressure is extremely strong, and conformity and getting along with the people in your world is really important. So, and then identity. People. Some people, have an identity, gosh, I would never eat tofu, or you have people who say, I would never eat meat, or whatever. People have all kinds of food identities. And recent work we've been doing, we've been blown away by how much identity is associated with what people eat. It's one of the biggest factors of things that predict what people eat in their daily diet, is how much it fits in with their identity. And this also in recent reviews comes up that you may have to change your identity of how you think of yourself and the kind of eater you think you are and the kind of person you think you are if you want to change your habits. Sort of maybe in traditional terms of habits, people wouldn't think about identity and these social factors as being so important, but they're probably incredibly important factors if you're trying to change habits.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder how, if you're consciously trying to change more of your habits, what would you recommend, like perhaps writing a list of the person you want to eventually end up as, or the identity you want to
Actually, we want to build an app for that, actually.
Oh, wow, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think, this is something this is at the heart of what our research is oriented towards these days, is trying to come up with an approach that sort of informs people about all these different phases of their habits, say for eating or for stress or whatever, and then teaches them about how they're habitually handling that kind of thing at the moment,
Mm-hmm.
and then work with them on the various phases of the situated action cycle to try to change that. I would say at this point, there are certainly therapists out there who are sort of, I think, well aware of all these different things you have to do, because then they take this comprehensive approach, trying to intervene on all these different things that we've been talking about. I think you can't take an isolated approach. You can't just try to change people's intentions. You have to take a comprehensive approach and deal with all of these factors if you want to change a health behavior.
Well, that's really interesting. I remember the ABC cognitive model that we used to look at, but maybe for people who, because I think in some ways New Year's resolutions are quite a good opportunity for people to reevaluate and make endpoints, but like you're saying, normally people don't think about the step-to-step actions that they need to address and develop in order to reach their end goal. It will just kind of be like, I'm going to read an article from the news every day, or that kind of thing. And then again, it's easier if you don't have that action plan and haven't considered all of the stages that go into it to catastrophize when you do fail, because you can't figure out exactly how to get back on the wagon.
No, it is so hard to change this conditioning, and I think anyone can tell you that who's tried to change themselves in some way. It is really hard, and in part it's because it is so complicated and multifaceted. Another thing is that as we know, this is basic cognitive psychology. As things become more habitual and better learned, they become decreasingly conscious. You become less aware of them. They become more involuntary and implicit, and it's just harder to see what's happening. And so if you want to change your habits, and a lot of it's implicit, it's hard to know what to do. And this is why it helps, I think, being informed by what science has learned about habits can be very useful, because it can identify all the different phases of the situated action cycle and the kinds of things in them. And it's going to take a little work for somebody to figure this all out. But if they're informed by a literature, and we have to figure out how to make this available to people, that teaches them about all the different parts of a habit, and makes them aware of it, and then offers choices and approaches for working with different pieces of it. I think that's really what it takes to make these changes, and it is really hard to do it on your own. I think the interesting cases, I think, where it happens for when people do it on their own, and I'm actually not even sure in these cases how much people actually really do it on their own, is when you have like a life-threatening disease, or there's something of huge consequence in your life, and then people really often do change their behavior, at least sometimes, and they figure things out. But I think it's because they're so motivated, they just stop doing everything else and focus on this and really figure it out. Maybe they do get help with that. But it is really hard to change this conditioning. The other thing about it that's really daunting, and we know this from like years of cognitive behavioral therapy, decades of research and practice, so what cognitive behavioral therapy does is try to identify your habitual cognitive patterns, typically associated with emotion and social interaction, dealing with your own thoughts and experience. And people get into bad habits about, their cognitive, how they deal with themselves and others cognitively. And what cognitive behavioral therapy tries to do is help people see these patterns, see them for what they are. So they're doing what we just described. They're going to look at all the different components of these patterns, and that usually takes some guidance to know where to look and what to look for. And then what you do is you come up with what's supposed to be an alternative cognitive pattern of cognition and behavior and emotion that you want to perform instead, and then you try to implement that. And what we know from decades of experience with this kind of thing is it's very, very hard to do.
Yeah, and you have to face, as well as the actual behaviours themselves, you have to look deeper and try and understand the causes, which often have a lot of emotional crutches, which are difficult to address.
Yep, the whole rational behavioral therapy was really the root of cognitive behavioral therapy, and this idea that these deep assumptions you make that are often incorrect, that are motivating a lot of the cognitive and behavioral patterns, and you need to get to the root of those, and that's really hard work. That's almost like classic psychoanalysis, and which takes years, and it's really, really hard to make these changes. And in conditioning, classic animal behaviorism has really important things to say about this. You can condition an animal to respond to a cue in a certain way for a reward, and you can really develop a lot of conditioning and over-conditioning, over-learning, such that this habit really gets burned in, and then you just extinguish the habit so that the animal no longer performs the response in response to the stimulus because the reward is no longer there. And so it would appear that the animal has lost this habit. And then later, if you wait a while and you reinstate the cue, all of a sudden the habit's back, and it's back, just as strong. It's spontaneous recovery from extinction. It's back as strong as it used to be. And so all these old habits we have are still they'll always be with us. Whatever bad habits you have, you'll never get rid of. And they're always waiting there to be cued and activated by the right conditions. So it is really, really hard then to create new habits, which are probably going to be weaker.
Yeah.
Relative to these old ones, and then have them replace them. That's why you need this comprehensive approach where you have to change your environment and maybe, get your social network on board with what you're doing, and think about. And I think a really intriguing one is maybe trying to change your identity, because the identity might be sort of like one of these root assumptions you were talking about a moment ago. That if you this point from which you can approach many things, you can always come back to it as a touchstone almost, and then just use it as a way to remind yourself that you're trying to do something different.
Would you recommend, in terms of the social network aspect, perhaps if you are trying to develop a new habit or get rid of an old one, someone you trust who you wouldn't feel was being critical of you, maybe you could ask them to help you identify the habit when you perform it? Do you know? That's
a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think having people who support you and know what you want and know what you might tend to do that might be inconsistent with what you now want, and helping you pursue, sort of dampen down those old behaviors and take on the new ones might be the most powerful thing, or a very, very powerful thing in changing your behavior. So if you can find a friend who wants to do the same thing, and you work on it together, that seems like a great idea.
I saw with people who were trying to take up exercising more regularly, it seems to be very effective when people do it in friendship groups. So if you have a gym buddy, I think they're called, who you agree to exercise with at various points during the week,
right,
you hold each other accountable. And that has now spread to, there are lots of fitness apps like Map My Run and that kind of thing, and you can join these international challenges, and it creates quite a good support network. So for people who, I don't know, are working towards a 5K, you can commit to the challenge, and then other people will encourage you to keep going.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That seems perfect for supporting the kind of change we're talking about.
In terms of breaking older or less useful habits rather than taking new ones up, like you were talking about earlier with stress, what kind of thing would you recommend, or what seems to be effective for very emotive situations like that and trying to change your habits within those?
Well, I mean, I'd say the traditional approaches would be monitoring of various kinds. So for dealing with stress, for example, or difficult emotions, there's something called stress inoculation therapy.
Okay.
And it's the basic idea is just to monitor your emotional landscape, and when something comes up that's difficult, you first thing is you become aware that that's happening, and then you, rather than just getting all worked up and lashing out or sort of reacting impulsively, you sort of slow down a little bit and say, okay, what am I going to do about that? And the first thing you try to do is say, can I change the world? Is there something in the world I can change that will make things better? You know, can I fix something? Can I talk to someone? Is there something that I can do that will resolve the situation? And if there is, then you do it. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing that this approach says that you should do is emotion regulation. So if you can't change the world, then you have to deal with yourself, and you want to change how you're responding to the situation. So what this really boils down to is monitoring, you know, learning to monitor, and then making these initial decisions about whether there's certain actions you can take or whether you're going to have to work with yourself. If you then need to work with yourself, the most common approach to doing that is what's called reappraisal.
Okay.
And it very much comes out of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is to reappraise the situation so that it's no longer as emotional. And so there are various aspects of affective situations, especially stressful situations, that make them challenging. And there are three basic causes that make situations stressful, and the most basic is that your expectations have been violated in some way. There's just something happening that you didn't expect to see, and even if it's something that it may not necessarily be negative, it's still a little bit. It's often viewed as stressful because you have to now deal with it. You don't have your cognitive habits. Don't operate because it's violating your expectations. And so you've now got to deal with whatever's happening. So like just moving somewhere, you might be really excited about moving somewhere new to a new city, but all your expectations about where everything is and what happens and what's going on are no longer operative because you're in a completely new setting. And so you now have to figure everything out, and that's a lot of work, and at some level that's stressful. And so the reappraisal is one reappraisal that you can do when you encounter an expectation violation is just try to accept what's happening and not fight it and not be sort of annoyed because things aren't as you expect or don't fit your expectations.
I find I quite like to plan things out, and I used to be very rigid. For example, when I travelled somewhere new, I'd have a list of things I wanted to do, and I'd have expectations about what we could get done in the day. And when I couldn't meet those, because often I tried to do what you do in a week in one day, I'd get very stressed even though I had had a brilliant time and enjoyed myself. I'd think, oh no, I haven't done everything I wanted to do. But now I try to, just like you're saying, think, oh, it would be nice if we could go to these various things, but I'm going to allow myself to not have expectations about how it will spend every minute and how everything will be. And I find I'm able to enjoy travelling, for example, a lot more with that approach.
That's such a great example. That's maybe the best example of this I've ever heard about. And I know exactly what you mean because I'm the same way. At the end of the day, I haven't gotten half the things done that I wanted to get done, and accepting that is exactly the kind of reappraisal that is relevant here.
Yeah.
So that's one cause of stress, is expectation violation. Probably the two biggest causes, though, and they go together, are threat and coping inefficacy.
Okay.
So threat is like when one of your self-interests is threatened in some way. And that can happen at so many levels. It could be physical, it could be, financial, it could be social. But threat is like one of the biggest factors that organisms constantly deal with at many levels. And if you actually sat down and you looked at all the ways that you're threatened over the course of a week, you would just be blown away by the amount of stuff that you get worked up about and that you potentially see as a threat. And the brain has huge systems designed for recognizing and gearing you up to deal with threat, which are actually really do a number on your brain and your body in terms of not being good for them and wearing them out and causing wear and tear. But basically, a lot of negative emotion comes from threat. And the other thing that tends to go with threat in stress is not being able to deal with the threat. So if you can deal with the threat readily, so that's going back to that first step of if you can act in the world to change things, the threat, it's not a threat. It's gone. But the problem is when you can't figure out how to resolve a threat. And this is the classic recipe for stress, is feeling threatened and not being able to deal with it. And so the kind of reappraisals, so we're jumping back and forth, but going back to this sort of classic strategy for dealing with emotion, you try to change the world, and then if you can't, then you regulate your emotion, and the first approach to doing that is reappraisal. For threat, you might try to talk yourself into why the threat isn't as serious as it is, or you might, the classic move is to turn it from a threat into a challenge.
Yeah, I remember seeing a video where a woman did a very scary, I think it was a roller coaster or something, but she said, I'm feeling scared now. I'm going to convince myself that the physiological things I'm feeling are excitement. And that seemed to work quite well for her, but perhaps people could try and do the same things with stress and see it as excitement or their body preparing for the situation.
Another great example. We're a good team.
Yeah.
So that's just a perfect example. But reappraising threat lies at the heart of emotion regulation. The other one that gets less attention is an inability to deal with things. And there you could maybe try harder to come up with a way to deal with it. Maybe try to think out of the box a little bit about how you could deal with it. A really great move at that point is to go seek support from others. Don't try to do it all on your own. Call in your social network or whatever other resources like that you might have. But sort of trying to reappraise your ability to act so that it doesn't seem like you can't do anything about it. Because what'll happen if you are threatened and if you're feeling really threatened and you believe you can't do anything about it, then you'll start ruminating.
Right.
And this is the classic marker of stress, and this is what really wears people out. And if you have too much of that going on and you ruminate about a lot of things, it's not good for you. It leads to depression. It generates inflammatory responses, which are really hard on your body. You're slightly aroused all the time, which is not good for your body.
In that way, I guess that's another way your social network can help you, because often talking and explaining the way that you're feeling to someone, even just voicing it out loud, can help you maybe see the irrational aspects of the way you're thinking, or someone else can input and say, oh, it's interesting to think about it that way because from what you've said before. And that's the basis of talking therapy, isn't it? To try and help people address those irrationalities.
Indeed, yeah.
And there was another thing I read about, I think earlier today in the BPS Research Digest, talking about emotional labelling, where when you're feeling even pleasant emotions, but often it's more relevant when you're feeling unpleasant emotions, rather than just thinking, I'm feeling really bad right now, you try and pinpoint the exact emotion you're feeling. So whether it's guilt or anger, frustration, and assign a clear-cut cause, at least in that moment, so that you can then think, okay, I'm feeling guilty because of this, so I have these ways to cope with it. which I think is a really interesting approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that leads to sort of the final approach that actually, there's another set of approaches having to do with things like exercise, dancing, that can really intervene on stress by just changing your bodily state, which then causes your cognitive states to change. So that's another sort of collection of interventions for which really fall under this emotion regulation sort of point of the strategy that we're talking about, that are also available to anyone to, and there's a lot of work showing that things like exercise and other sorts of physical activities can be really effective for reducing stress and especially reducing the destructive bodily responses that your body makes in response to situations like this. The one other thing I should mention before we return to the point you made about labeling it is that there's another whole collection of strategies people do in these situations which are not recommended, but they're things like eating, drinking, drugs, violence, abuse, all that stuff. There are lots of sort of destructive ways to deal with negative emotion too that people do a lot, and it's sort of good to be aware, that there are possibilities and to, pursue them with care.
Yeah, there's an idea I read about. There's a comedian, Robert Webb, who was in Peep Show. He wrote a book recently called How Not to Be a Man, which is a very good, funny read about his experience growing up. But he was talking about, he believes what he perceives as his toxic masculinity when he was younger happened because as a young boy he was told his acceptable emotions were anger or being happy. So whenever he felt any kind of unpleasant emotion, he was like, oh well, the only way I can channel this is anger, so I'm going to punch something or I'm going to shout at someone. And from my own experience, I don't know, haven't read into it all that much, but I think younger girls are often encouraged a lot more to talk with each other about how they're feeling and process their emotions. So maybe they have more experience doing emotional labelling, whereas young men are often told that it's sissy or that kind of thing to talk about how they feel, which is maybe why I think I'll try and find statistics to support this when I post the podcast, but more young men generally tend to have more violent outbursts or go into self-medication and alcoholism, perhaps because they feel that they're not as open or they don't have the opportunity to express their emotions in the same way that young women do, which I think is something which is slightly changing with people my age, because millennials, or I think I'm just younger than a millennial, but everyone talks about how young men are no longer men because they talk about their emotions and they hug each other. But I think in some ways that's a very hopeful thing for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that there are huge distributions within each gender.
Yeah.
I mean, and there are these sort of statistical differences, and they're no doubt there. But often the variability within a distribution is much bigger than the difference between the distributions. So you have men of all types, you have women of all types, who display everything, and both genders probably largely display everything that's possible, maybe in somewhat different proportions, but so it really comes down perhaps more to individual differences than to gender differences, even though there definitely are gender differences at the mean level. And I think it also really, as we were just talking about, comes down to identity, so like I'm the kind of person who doesn't talk to other people about my emotions, that would be a total identity kind of thing. And you have to change the kind of person you think you are to change how you deal with your emotions. The last thing that I wanted to talk about related to the labeling is mindfulness. Which is very much in the spirit of what you described for labeling. And so in all of the strategies we've been talking about so far, you're still sort of in the situation that's troubling you. Even when you're reappraising it in all these different ways, you're still working with the situation in one way or another. And there's another whole set of strategies where you try to sort of detach yourself from the situation and just watch yourself sort of processing it and dealing with it. And in this stepping back from everything your brain is doing in these situations is an incredibly powerful move. And everybody can do it. So we do a lot of work in our group and have been for some time. Esther Papia, who's also on staff here, and I've been doing this work a long time. Other people have been doing it as well, showing you can take people who are not meditators and they can instantly do this. They can step back from their experience. And sometimes this is referred to as decentering, de-reification, but it basically involves taking the mental states that you usually have, like when you're stressed out, and rather than feeling like you're immersed in them and experiencing all the stuff that goes on in that kind of event, you instead step back and see that your brain is producing these mental states, and you see them as mental states that your brain is producing. And you, in a way, distance yourself from them. It's not just distancing. You actually change your relation to the thoughts, and you see them in a different way.
Oh, that's very interesting. I guess in some ways it would be quite useful to see any students who have an example to do this, but maybe watching a scan or something of your brain going through the states in an fMRI might help people to see that it's a process that their brain is going through and help them think about it in a less immersive way and consider it more objectively.
Well, yeah, we're just finishing up an fMRI study that looked at this.
Oh, wow, okay.
It's actually the second fMRI study we've done looking at non-meditators' ability to step back and decenter from their mental states. And in the first study, it was on stress, and this one we're doing right now is on food.
Okay.
And these the results in both experiments have been extremely surprising and interesting, and I think they're really potentially important, especially the one that we're doing right now that we're just about ready to write up. And what we did in this experiment was we showed people pictures of foods.
Okay.
Highly tasty foods like a piece of pizza, chips, cake, things like that. And then healthy foods like broccoli and salads and so forth.
You can hear your voice change when you go pizza and then broccoli and salads.
Okay, well that's interesting. I'm sure Phil will appreciate that.
Yes, yeah.
Phil and I have talked about I think maybe he's done it or somebody's done it, looking at voice changes as people talk about healthy and tasty foods. Yeah. It is really interesting indeed, very observant. But so we showed people pictures of these two kinds of foods in the scanner, and we had two groups of 20 participants each. One group was asked to just look at these pictures and just sort of interact with them as they normally would. Just imagine you see this piece of pizza and just sort of imagine how, if you were to encounter this in the world, how you would think about it, what you might think about doing, and so forth. So it's very much just what's your natural response when you see these foods, and it's a control condition that we and a lot of other people have used quite a few times. Works really well. And the other group, we asked them, we call this the observe condition, even though it could be called sort of a mindfulness condition, because it is what we think is the active ingredient of mindfulness, is we say, okay, you're going to see this picture of a piece of pizza, and your mind's going to start, all the habitual cognitive and affective responses that you make to things like pizza will start running in your brain. And we want you to watch them and observe them and just experience them and see them as constructions that your brain is producing in the moment. And then just watch them arise and dissipate.
So do you encourage people to do that in a particular way, as in like seeing the words or trying to picture, like name what they're feeling?
We don't go into that kind of detail, but our results, I think, speak to it. And it's actually something that really needs to be followed up. But we just ask them to observe their thoughts and to be aware that they're going to have thoughts in response to these stimuli, to observe them and to watch them arise and dissipate. We don't say much more than that. I mean, I'll come to the main results in a second, but one thing we do find is that in this observed condition, there's much more activation of left hemisphere language areas.
Okay.
And also cortical midline areas associated with self-thought. So there's probably, I suspect, and this needs to be confirmed with future experiments, there is a lot more talking going on about, and it's probably about people's mental states. But that's just a conjecture at this point. We see activation in all these language and speech areas, but we need to confirm that it is really about language because there's some other possibilities. But so we have these two groups of participants, and so there are two phases to the experiment. In the first phase, so we give them the minimal amount of training outside of the scanners. So they aren't meditators, and we don't give them much training before they go in. We just tell them what the strategy is that they're supposed to perform. They perform one of these two strategies. And then they really practice it in the scanner so we can look at their neural activity while they're learning the strategy. And so they do this for maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and we measure their neural activity as they're either doing this just normal viewing, interacting with the foods, or observing how your brain is responding to them. After they do that, we go into a second phase of the experiment where we show them all the foods again along with some additional foods. And and for each food, they have to say whether they would want to eat it right now. Binary response, yes or no. And so it's just a classic food choice task. And the results we get, we actually found a very similar pattern in an earlier experiment on stress, which I'm not going to describe, but we've essentially replicated that pattern now with food. What happens is that in the training phase, you see much more activity all over the brain for the observed condition than for the normal viewing condition.
Okay.
And it's especially in areas that process food, like taste areas and reward areas, but also in mentalizing areas, motor and somatosensory areas, even visual areas, and then especially these language areas. But there's just much more activity. And what we think is going on, and again, this depends on future work, is that people are watching what's becoming active through their conditioned habits to food, and then they're processing it in a little more detail as they try to watch it, and in the process they may be labeling it more.
And understanding all the different activities going on.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this again is in non-meditators, but what it means is that this very simple instruction fundamentally and these are really big differences. These are not little tiny differences. These are really big differences in activation. So then in the choice phase, it completely flips.
Okay.
What happens is now in the choice phase, as people are making choices about the foods, there's much more activity in the normal viewing condition in all of these areas than in the decentering or the observed condition. And so going through this observed process is now really changing how people are processing the foods. Interestingly, it doesn't change their behavioral responses at all. Okay. That's shocking. And in previous behavioral work, we have found that it changes their responses, so we're a little surprised. The design of the study is different from the other things that we and others have done. It was also done in a scanner, which could be a factor. But the behavioral responses don't change, but they're huge neural responses as a function of having done this. So, but the point of all this is, just to sort of then back up to where we were before we talked about this experiment, is that it's possible when you're having an affective experience, like especially a stressful one, but foods as well, to sort of step back and watch what's happening and watch it arise and dissipate. And this is what trained, serious mindfulness practice and serious meditation training really aims to do. Is to make it habitual to at least have the ability to step back from what your brain is doing and not get immersed in it and become reactive to it immediately. Now, there are definitely times you want to react to your mental. You don't want to just be sitting there, watching your brain and not doing something as a train is approaching you. But But at least you have the ability to shift into that mode. And to the extent that you can shift into that mode more, it gives you more control.
And reduces the automaticity of your response.
Exactly. You can still decide to go with those automatic responses, but if for some reason, like you are trying to change your habits, you now have the ability to maybe not immediately go with what your brain is telling you to do first and say, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be doing, what I really want to be doing is this.
Yeah.
And so you create what's called a gap between so your immediate impulses and what your intentions are, and what your behavior is. So there's a gap between your initial processing and your behavior that then allows you to maybe have a little bit more control and choice over what you do. And so that's, I think, one of the benefits of these kinds of practices is that it slows people down a little bit.
Yeah.
And makes people a little bit more deliberate.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and all the best luck with your research. When it's published, I can put a link in the Psychology Society website and things.
Thanks again. This has been great.
Yeah. As a final note, are there any habits you want to pick up that you're hoping for this year? I'm trying to take vitamin every day because I became vegetarian at the start of uni, and my parents are worried I'm lacking vitamins. So my tip is to put them in plain sight when I wake up in the morning so that I have to see them every day. That's a good strategy and a worthy goal. This podcast was created by Amelia Hilton in association with the Glasgow University Psychology Society. It was recorded by Amelia Hilton and Professor Lawrence Barsalou. It was produced by Amelia Hilton and edited by Jack Harding, with original music by Jack Harding. It was recorded in the University of Glasgow School of Psychology and Neuroscience Speech Lab.